Where are you at today when I'm calling you? Where are you?
This is, my home in California.
Oh, you're back in California over the Christmas
Oh,
holidays? So I think the thing I wanna, this has been like a huge year for you to change, lots of change in your life this year. And, now you're running NIH. But when did you, because I don't think I really read about it. How did you find out? Like how did like, were you down in Mar-a-Lago? Like, did you get a call? Like, what was your first inkling that I think I'm gonna be nominated to run the NIH? Like, how did that happen for you?
it actually after President Trump won in November, people had been talking, some folks who were close to Bobby's campaign and other folks had been talking and suggesting that I should reach out to people about wanting to be potentially an NIH director. Bobby reached out to me, actually. He and his team reached out to
Okay.
me first in November, and we had this conversation, which I thought went really well. I wanted to be helpful. So I said, I'm happy to do whatever job Bobby wanted me to do, including potentially being an NIH director. Apparently, I'm bad at job interviews, Paul, because I've only had like one in 25 years. So I sent the impression apparently that I didn't want the job. That
Oh.
it took an intervention by some friends.
That's what you wanna do. And that's the best way to, like, get the date is pretend that you don't want a date, and then, then you're desired, they start chasing you.
I actually did want the job because I'd been thinking deeply about how to reform the NIH for a long time, even before the pandemic. I've been a bit subject of some of my scholarly work. And then so a friend of mine reached out to Bobby's team and told them, "Oh, no, Jay definitely wants to help." Um, and they reached out to me and got that all cleared up. And then the tweet from President Trump came out, and I was just absolutely thrilled.
Did you have to go fly down, like, as part of your process, I mean, did you have, like, just a phone conversation with Bobby? Because like, he had already been nominated for HHS, right? And he was putting together a team. So did you have, like, a conversation with him? Did you fly, out I mean, he lives in California where you do. Did you fly down to meet him and talk to him in person? How did that whole thing work out?
Yeah, so there were in-person interviews in Palm Beach. They had like a
Okay.
nondescript office. It wasn't actually at Mar-a-Lago, the meeting with
Oh,
Bobby. The official second interview with Bobby that happened in this nondescript office in Palm Beach. There were like, it was folks from the presidential personnel office as well who interviewed me as well as a few others. But Bobby was the main interview there. That happened after the sort of the online interviews. And it was after that that I got the official tweet from the president. I did actually meet with the president in January, but that's a topic for another time. In January 2025, where it wasn't clear that he realized how he had already offered me the job.
okay.
But it was like at the end of it, it was like, Jay, you're hired. So that I thought that went okay, I guess.
Did he look up and did he call you the wrong name? Did he say, "Nice to meet you, Dr. Marty McCary," or something like did he
But it was, I mean, he's obviously very good at assessing people, and we spent an hour. I spent an hour. This was after the tweet where you had already hired me. I
right,
think just he wanted to get to know me a little bit better. But the way he does
right,
that is it's very interesting. That is a topic for another time, Paul. But
right.
it was let's just say a nerve wracking hour with the president, where wasn't clear to me that he realized he'd already offered me the job.
Why would it be nerve-wracking to meet the president of the United States, like, about potentially offering you a job? I have no clue. I
I mean,
mean,
I seriously have not had a job interview in decades. So this was baptism by fire.
so how did you what kinda tell people, because 'cause it's been, again, you came in, I wanna say February, and there were all these changes we can get into about changes that had already happened at the NIH. There'd been a bunch of grants cut off, a whole bunch of changes that happened before you even came into the office. But what was this first year like? I mean, you've gone from, I mean, you were this 6 years ago, you were this guy who no one really heard of outside of economics, of health economics. Then you're getting more and more into the media throughout the pandemic because you're, criticizing and pointing out problems with the way the pandemic was being handled. And then suddenly, like, now you're like the NIH director who's basically sitting on top of the biggest bucket of money on the planet for biomedical research. So how did this whole year kind of go? Like, you've never been in federal service before. You've been at Stanford since you were like 17 or 18. And now you have to move to Washington and you're in charge of this big bureaucracy. Like, what has that been like?
I mean, it was personally traumatic, honestly, because as you say, I've been here. This is what recording on New Year's Eve, I guess, in California. I'm in California. Um, it was traumatic. Like I had to change my entire life. Like my move from a place where I've lived for 25 years. All three of my kids went off, were leaving the house anyways because they're headed to college or they're doing other things with their lives. And I had to retire from my job at Stanford and enter this job, which was honestly was challenging at the beginning. It was April actually, April of 2025 when I started, early April.
Okay.
And it was the day that the government, the Doge, announced the reduction in force, the RIF, all across Health and Human Services. So, the 3,000 some people, I guess, had just lost their job at the NIH the day I started. So it was challenging to say the least. There was a lot of anxiety at the NIH, sort of understandably having to do with the reduction in force, this RIF, as they call it. Where and the
So I
fact
want to
that
ask you, how many people? So I think it's around 15,000 people, and that first riff let out about 1,000 or something like that. And
no, it was
what happened?
21,000 people at the NIH the
Okay,
day before I joined.
right.
And at the day I joined, about 3,000, I forget exactly the exact number, but there were about 17,000, 18,000 people after that riff. So a substantial
About
fraction of the workforce.
15%, 20%, something like that were let go.
Yeah, on that order.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And it was for me watching from the outside. I mean, any organization has inefficiencies. You want to uh, assign people the tasks that they're good at. You want to rethink processes so that you reduce paperwork. I mean, I read a lot about how to manage large organizations, obviously, in order to prepare. But it seemed to me as I walked in that there wasn't that process hadn't been gone through
Okay.
before in deciding how the risk. So I felt the pain of all the folks who lost their jobs. I mean, I understood exactly why they were upset, but it was frustrating because there was not much I could do about it from the outside. There's this thing called the Vacancies Act, Paul, that you're not allowed when you're appointed but not yet confirmed by the Senate to say anything or do anything or have any contact with people in the agency because you don't want to act as if you're leaving the agency before the Senate has confirmed you. And so
I
I was
see.
frustrating to watch from the outside where I could say or do nothing while all these decisions were getting
So
made.
so this is that time period between your nomination, you haven't been confirmed. I remember at the time you were being blamed for things, if I remember correctly, you were being blamed for things in the media when you were actually legally disallowed from having any involvement at the time, and the White
Yeah,
House was sitting on your head, making sure you didn't do anything.
yeah. Because there's you don't want to violate the Vacancies Act. That's the sure way to not get the nomination, because the
Right,
Senate gets to decide before you get to do anything. And also the advice to all the nominees. This is between let's say January and March of 2025, when I hadn't been appointed yet. Um, the advice to all nominees is just stay quiet, don't talk to the media. So all these
right,
like things happening. So I couldn't do anything internally, and I also couldn't do anything. I couldn't like defend myself in the media because the advice was don't talk to the media from the White
right.
House. So it was kind of, I mean, after 5 years of essentially being able to say what I think, with all this like suppression and censorship and all that, but at the very least getting being able to at least say without being like directly, effectively self-censoring. I
Right.
had to self-censor.
So, well, you had Twitter, like, basically, like, no tweeting, no nothing, just
No tweet.
how did you survive without Twitter? I mean,
It
that
was
was
cold turkey at first. It was really frustrating because I see people say things that were like just not true, like straight
right.
up, and I was like, even friends, and I was like, what the, I can't, I can't, I can't report.
So I wanna go over some of the big things that have been in the media that, are well, okay, I wanna this because this one was just so silly. One of the big things that, Trump put out was in May of this year that he's gonna kill off gain-of-function research. They're gonna rein some of that in. And, they've been working on this executive order. So this is not a law. This is an executive order that Trump's putting out a policy. And then this article came out in the Daily Caller that made all these accusations against the NIH. And what was amazing at the time is when I read that article, I knew it was wrong because I had already been leaked like 2 months prior some internal emails from what happened in the last process. And I looked at the emails and I was like, Wow, there's a lot of people involved. You got DOD, you got HHS, you got CIA, you got FBI. And then I'm reading this Daily Caller story that basically says the NIH is trying to undermine the White House. I remember my first thought was, how do they do that? So, like, I just want to go through some questions here. I just want to make sure. Do you control the Department of Justice from the NIH?
I do not, Paul.
Okay.
I do not.
I want to make sure that, because, like, do you control the CIA? Because they're also involved in this. Do you control the CIA?
I do not control the CIA, Paul.
How
I
about
don't
the
think they
Department of
listen to
Justice?
me.
How about Department of Justice? Do you control the Department of
No,
Justice?
I don't control the DOJ. I don't control the DOD.
You don't control the White
Oh,
House either.
actually, I guess they're called the Department of War now. But yeah, I don't control them either.
Right, right, right. So basically, the White House is in charge of this policy that's supposed to be coming out sometime soon. What was that like dealing with? I mean, like, there's still like stuff on Twitter about how why is the NIH trying to undermine what's happening and you're not in charge of this? The White House is in charge. Like, I mean, what do you? I mean,
It's well,
I have friends, I have people inside the NIH that I was talking to at the time because I was confused at the time. They're like, this makes no sense. I mean, what
it
were you
didn't make
doing
any. It's
internally?
actually quite frustrating. This is part of the. Okay, let me try. Let's back up and let me just make a defense about anxiety and worry about the NIH around this issue of dangerous gain of function, right? So
Right,
the last process, something weirdly called the P3CO process, that was put in place in 2017 in the dying days
right.
of the Obama administration.
So
That pro-
that's the emails that I have when that process came out, and I was given those emails by someone inside the intelligence community. You can see when that process came out, there's like it's 4 pages of emails of the people that were involved, and there's like only like I think 6 or 7 of them are from the NIH, but there's people from
yeah,
all over
like
the I didn't even know.
just to
Yeah,
back up and give context, right? That's in 2017. What had happened was that there had been a pause put in place in all dangerous gain of function
right,
research during the Obama administration. Tony Fauci and Francis Collins fought against that pause. There was a famous Washington Post op-ed that they wrote together in, I think it was 2011 or 2012, with the title "A Flu Risk Worth Taking," where they made the argument that doing this kind of dangerous gain of function work was necessary to be able to predict and prevent future pandemics. So even if there was a risk of leaking, a lab leak, that it was a risk worth taking. They
right,
lost that policy fight. There was a pause, but they put in place a new regulatory framework across the whole government, not just the NIH, not
right,
they, like the White House put together a
right,
regulatory framework across the whole government, because it's not just the NIH where this kind of potentially dangerous research happens. It happens at the
right.
USDA, potentially it happens at the DOW, it happens to a whole host of government agencies support research that potentially could fit in this bucket of, if it leaks, then you could cause a pandemic.
Well, also the other thing that I found out from talking to people inside the intelligence community is it's not just the people funding and doing the research. You also have to have this agreement across the government because DOD is monitoring this stuff in other countries. State Department is negotiating, treaties on this issue. I didn't realize, I did not understand like that it was so complex until actually I got these emails.
Yeah, it touches a very large number of agencies in the government. It has to be coordinated. It has to be carefully managed. It can't just be one. I mean, the NIH is a major player in it, absolutely, because we fund biomedical research. Most of it,
Right,
the vast majority of it, have no chance of causing a pandemic. The question is the small sliver of research that has a chance of causing a pandemic. Now, that process, that 2017 P3CO process, involved the whole government. But let me
right,
just make a defense of some of the reporting. Um, in 2017, what happened was that process that was put in place, this P3CO process, involved checking from a list of pathogens. Says, are you working on Ebola? Are you working on some things that are dangerous?
right,
And and it relied on essentially a self-reporting process where, like, the agencies would offer up a grant that looks like it checked the box on one of the lists, and then there'd be a group of people, like three or four, of a few people with expertise in deciding whether this was actually dangerous or not.
right,
Whether in the entire history of the P3CO process from 2017 to 2025, exactly 4 grants, 3 or 4 grants, I've heard different accounts, went up to the group of people that were deciding whether it was dangerous.
right.
Including like the proposals to do research in Wuhan on coronaviruses, that didn't go up. the process. That was
Right.
never even considered in the process where like a group of experts got to decide whether or not the thing should go forward. There was a policy in place and it was toothless. And the
Right.
NIH played a role, not the only role, but it played a role in making the process toothless.
Right.
Right. So
Now,
in 2017,
one of the things that I heard is that the NIH was giving a lot of passes to various grants instead of running through the P3CO process. And apparently, the sign off for allowing them to not go through the process, Senator Rand Paul has documents showing that this happened. He's sitting over it in his committee. I've been told this by Senate staffers that he has the whole list. I don't know why he's not come out with this.
yeah, I mean, it's definitely true. I mean, I don't know. I wasn't in, obviously I was a Stanford professor. You say I was largely known among health economists, and I wasn't like part of any of these deliberations at the time in between 2017 and 2025. But you can see what the outcomes of it. Only 3 grants went up, or 4
Right.
grants went up to the for consideration in this P3CO process during the whole entirety of 2017 to 2025. And as far as I know, I don't think any DoD grants went up, no grants from USDA went up. It was basically a toothless process for the entire government, even though the entire government spent a lot of effort trying to coordinate that process and put it into place right before Obama left office.
Right.
Okay, so all right, so that's the backdrop of what happened this year.
Right.
I think there were people who were very frustrated on the outside, pushing for us, for the government, to not do this kind of research and to
Right.
have a regulatory process that oversaw it. And so, of course, there's like a lot of distrust. Like once I learned of this, sometime around 2021, I became distrustful of the government on this. Like I
Right.
didn't just between 2021 and 2025, I tried between and I'm sorry, 2024 and President Trump's election. I was deeply frustrated during the Biden administration because really clear to me they were not taking their obligation to regulate this work seriously. And
Right.
there was a renewed process to try to figure out to strengthen it right at the end of the Biden administration.
Okay.
And there were people that had put together a process that was supposedly going to work better than the P3CO process, but it took 4 years.
Right.
And it was run by the White House, just as it should be, because the White House coordinates across all of the different agencies. The version of the regulatory process that had been put forward at the end of the Biden years to revise the PTCO process was this long, complicated document with like to my eyes obvious loopholes, right? So
Okay.
again, it focused on a list of pathogens that said, "Are you working on Ebola? Are you working on West Nile virus or whatever?" And it was a list-based thing with like exceptions, and it looked just unworkable to me. The process that we've had now is a risk-based process. That's the idea
Okay.
that the White House is working on. Instead of saying, "Are you working on a list of one of a list of pathogens?" The question is the research you're doing, does it pose a potential existential threat to
Right.
humankind? Does it have a chance of causing a pandemic? Because for instance, the research that likely caused the pandemic was on a virus pulled out of a bat cave in China that was not on no list anywhere,
Right. Right.
right? And so the question, but was it risky? Yeah, it was risky. So the new process, the focus is risk, making sure that there's a you have a sense of the expert eyes get to see and oversee other people's proposed work to assess the risk of causing a pandemic. Second, uh, accountability to make sure that every part of this chain of deciding whether you get to do this research, you have accountability, right? So the researcher, if they fail to report up a risk, they potentially face severe penalties if ex post people decide that they were taking a risk. The institution where the researcher is doing the work, they're going to face severe penalties if they don't oversee the researcher to make sure that they report up the chain anything that potentially has a risk. There's the institutions like the NIH. We also are going to have to face to like be overseen by independent body, not us. It shouldn't be us checking our own home.
Because that last process basically was the NIH checking itself, right? I mean, the NIH would decide whether this grant looks risky or not, and we'll run it through this process, and we're controlling the process. That was a
Yeah.
weird.
Well, I mean, I don't think the NIH controlled the people that were supposed to evaluate the grants at but
Right.
the NIH did decide whether to send the grant up to the process, and the same thing for the DOW, for USDA, all the other entities of the government. They all get to they all get to decide, but there was no accountability in that decision. Um, the new process, I mean, it's still the White House is still working on it, but I have a lot of hope that it's going to be it's going to be risk based. It's going to have accountability at the core of it for every single decision maker, as well as penalties for if they fail to report. The key thing will be, um, as I said earlier, Paul, most of research, biomedical research, has no potential harm of causing a pandemic. It's only a small sliver of it. The key
Right.
idea is report up more than the sliver. Let the expert independent body, whatever it turns out to be, do an evaluation of the risk and check the homework of all the different entities that are doing this kind of grant funding, including the NIH, um, and then make a risk-based decision. If there's any risk
Right.
of causing a pandemic, no, you can't do it. If there is no risk, you've reported up things that you think someone might think there's a risk, but it turns out there isn't. Then you get permission to do it. Right? It's going to be a risk-based framework where everyone's checking each other's homework, and there's penalties involved if you don't report.
I want to ask you, one of the other big things that's happened too at the NIH has been, well, I mean, this is not just at the NIH, it's been across the government, but is ending grants and stuff. And so some of the grants that you've ended, have, that has gotten a lot of attention. But one of the things that's not gotten attention is something that I've been told, because I've had two people inside the NIH, I don't know if you read them or not, write anonymous pieces for my newsletter. One is a very senior person inside the NIH, and one is a little bit more junior. But and they didn't write this in the pieces they wrote for me, but they both told me, speaking on the phone, that one of the things they hated about the DEI stuff inside the NIH, it wasn't so much the grants targeted for DEI or the fact that they, minorities or women get a little bit more of a bump to get a job or a grant or something like that. That they didn't care that much about. They hated the teach-ins, like the sort of, like, one person described them as like communist like teach-ins in which you're told about microaggressions and all this kind of stuff. And one person told me, it's like you just basically, you knew to shut up, because if you said anything, you might be fired. I mean, how come that never came out? The type of internal NIH processes with these, that were going on, that never didn't come out.
I mean that was the case also in universities like Stanford. Like
Right.
there were essentially at the NIH. What I discovered was that DEI principles were embedded into almost every aspect of decision making inside the NIH, including things you say, training for microaggressions. You had to write what looks to me like a loyalty oath to the principles of DEI, or else
Right.
you would face, like intramural scientists who work as at the NIH, in order to get renewed funding for the next 5 years, would have to essentially write a loyalty oath to DEI, or else they get dinged. And including Matt Memley, my deputy director, he showed me a document that he was required to write. He actually ended up writing something saying that he's a devout Christian, doesn't believe in discriminating against other people, that love is your neighbor is like the centerpiece of how he thinks. In response, essentially as an act of defiance, because what they're looking for was essentially, the normal mantra for what you would say if you were a devotee of DEI. And the performance evaluations were all included things like, did you include diversity elements and implement diversity in your research work? Which it
Right.
was like every single aspect of the NIH functionality had DEI embedded in it. And of course, we were funding a very large number of grants that on DEI related, sort of DEI focused sort of paradigms across the NIH portfolio extramurally. At the end of the year, there was leftover money. What would happen is that program officers would go to people in the researchers of the community and say, well, look, we have leftover money. You should apply for a diversity supplement. Right? So if you're working
Okay.
on DEI, you could get the leftover money. If you were working on something else, potentially very important, you couldn't get the leftover money. DEI became embedded in every aspect of what we did. The thing I want to emphasize, Paul, is that it's very important that the NIH research the kinds of diseases and conditions that minority populations have.
Right.
Minority populations are American. The mission of the NIH is to improve their health, just as it's to improve everyone's health. If you look at the track record of DEI improving the health of people in the of minorities in the country, it is abysmal. Right? Since 2010, there's been no change in life expectancy, no improvement in life expectancy for minority Americans in the for Black Americans in the United States. None. It's been flatlined. And of course, it collapsed during the pandemic. All of
Right.
that DEI work that the NIH focused on for a decade and a half did not translate over to better health for minority populations.
Let me ask you this. Did it provide good jobs for DEI officials inside universities and academics research centers? I mean, I'll tell you something. Like I think it was University of Michigan, the New York Times did a piece about it, and it talked about how much money they spent on DEI stuff, which I think it was University of Michigan. It had like the biggest DEI program. And I looked at this and I was like, oh my god, like, what if they'd have taken that money? I mean, think about how many, like, just, poor, like, minorities there are who can't, like, maybe have good grades, maybe not excellent grades, but don't really just, like, I can't go to school because, like, I'm the first Black kid in my family, whatever, trying to go to college, and I just can't do it because of the money, this and that. Why didn't they fund these kids to go to school? Give them a free ride scholarship instead of spending money on these like $190,000 salaries in Michigan for some DEI official. I've really enraged. I'm a first generation kid going to college. So when I saw that kind of stuff, I was like, are you kidding me? You wasted that kind of money on this stuff?
I think that focus it may have made a few people feel good about themselves because they felt like they were trying to do something to right historical injustices, racial injustices in this country. Right? No one's arguing that those historical injustices didn't exist. The issue is that the thing that you do, in this case DEI, does it actually make the lives of minorities better? And the answer
Right.
is no. It did not make the lives of minorities better. Our mission at the NIH is to do research that improves the health and well-being and longevity of Americans. And yet, minority populations face tremendous chronic disease problems, along with the rest of the country, frankly. Chronic disease problems, life expectancies has flatlined, tremendous health problems. And the NIH's work did not work, especially on DEI, did not actually have any chance of improving the health of minority populations. And you can see that it didn't. So I think that the shift away from DEI is of a piece with the rest of what we're trying to do at the NIH, which is to do research that actually makes the lives of people better, cures diseases, extends life, shifting the portfolio away from DEI, shifting all of the processes where DEI is no longer front and center, but rather rigor in your research, reproducibility of the research, ideas that address the health problems of the people of the country. I think that's going to pay dividends over the next few
Well,
years.
it's interesting you bring that up because that's what I noticed too, right? I mean, what you're doing is you're shifting your portfolio. We're focusing on different things. Yet I will read story after story in the New York Times, the pharmaceutical industry's favorite media outlet, Stat News, in which you're killing science, and I'm like, I read this, I'm like, no, you're not killing science. We're just not funding that research anymore. We're going to fund other. I don't see them doing stories about, hey, we started funding this new grant. And there's this like happy, like, hey, look at this grant that got funded over here for this new thing that they couldn't get any money before. And I don't understand. I mean, I'd, I'd like, where is the New York Times story on that? And I don't see it.
I think there was a 60 Minutes piece about a researcher in Boston, like a 70-plus-year-old researcher in Boston, with the claim that like she lost a grant. I think she actually lost her grant before I forget exactly the details, but but she lost her grant, and somehow because she lost this grant, she's been funded for 30 plus years, and because she lost this grant this time, that we're not going to get a cure for breast cancer. If only you had funded her 35th first year, then we would get a cure for breast cancer. I mean,
Right.
I mean, I think the thing is, if you look, this is research that I did before the pandemic. If you look at the age of ideas that NIH funded researchers were working on. In the
Right.
1980s, NIH funded researchers were working on ideas and publishing ideas that were 0, 1, or 2 years old, really on the bleeding edge. By the
Right.
mid 2000s, 2000 teens, NIH researchers were working on ideas that were 7 or 8 years old. For many,
Right.
many, many different reasons, the NIH has become essentially a much more sort of risk averse in its ideas that it supported. It was essentially funding older, later career researchers that were working on older ideas, and that needed to change. That needs to change if we're going to get fundamental transformation of American health through research. We need to fund research on ideas that are not currently in this, that like widely accepted in the status quo, because those status quo ideas haven't translated over to better health. I mean, there's
Right.
some things that are worth investing in continuing down the lines. I mean, of course, obviously genetics research. There's a whole bunch of other research lines that are still worth investing in. But I want cutting edge ideas. I want rigor and reproducibility at the core of what we do. I don't want just to fund research just because they've been funded for 30 plus years.
Right. I mean, if you're a 78-year-old researcher getting a big NIH grant, there's a 35-year-old researcher who's not getting a big grant. I mean, it's like but there's this weird thing, like said, like the money disappeared. I'm like, the money doesn't disappear; it just went in another direction. But you
Yeah,
never see those stories.
we like there were all these stories over the course of the summer, this past summer, about how the NIH wasn't going to spend its money, it wasn't going to fund research. You know, we spent the full allocation of money that the Congress gave to the NIH last year, almost $50 billion, and all of that money went to research, Paul. I mean, so I don't really understand these stories, except to say that, you know, people are not, the NIH as an institution hasn't really changed in decades, right?
Right.
The like fundamental transformation of the NIH really hasn't happened in decades. And so a lot of people who are used to the old way of doing things, where they would get money for 7 or 8 year old ideas for their entire career, are unhappy. I'm not, you know, if that 70 researcher proposes a new idea that's really promising, I want to fund it. I don't want, I mean, it's not the question directly of the age of the scientist. It's the question of the age of the ideas that the scientists are proposing.
Right.
I want to fund research that is at the cutting edge. And to do that, there's a lot of change that has happened and will continue to happen at the NIH, because we have to change the culture, not just the NIH, but of science, of the biomedical sciences, which has gotten to this position where if have a new challenging idea, it's very difficult to get support.
Yeah. It's funny. There's a whole history of this kind of stuff. The guy who discovered knockout mice, I'm blanking on his name right now. He had an Italian last name, and he was at University of Utah. And I had just graduated from college in the '90s, and he came and gave a talk at Emory. And I remember, I mean, this is such a common theme, I think, with NIH researchers. He had an NIH grant. He applied for an NIH grant to study how to make knockout mice, which became like, I think in one year was like the top. Science magazine gave it like it was the top in, discovery of that year or something. But he tried to get it funded by the NIH. They turned it down. He then took his NIH money from another thing, basically stole it, because like I had postdocs were talking about this at Emory. They came out, they're like, oh my god, he stole his money, like from the NIH grant. Did the studies to get the initial data, then resubmitted back to the NIH, and then they funded him after he had taken NIH money to do the discovery that NIH wouldn't fund. It's just like, I mean, and it's now, found it, I know he gave this talk, but then I found it in the New York Times. And I think this is very common that people do this all the time.
Yeah, one of the things about study sections, so study sections are review panels that look, so we get 100,000 applications a year, and you can't fund all of them, right? You fund maybe 10% of them. So what we have is a scientific review panel that reviews every single grant, all 100,000 grant applications. Is it scientifically rigorous? Is it a new idea? Is it cutting edge? How good are the investigators that are doing it? How good is the environment what's being proposed to do? Those study sections, I can tell you, as someone who sat on study sections for decades, um, tend to emphasize: will the grant application, will of the proposed idea, does it have a chance? Is it rigorous? Is it likely to work? It
Right,
underemphasizes: is it brand new? If it actually works out, will it change how we think about how to manage or cure type 2 diabetes?
right.
Will it, is it a would it, if it works out, would it be a major breakthrough in how we think about this biological process? It underemphasizes innovation, the study sections, and overemphasizes methods. We put in place changes in the last 6 months to fundamentally transform that, to put the focus of these scientific review panels on how innovative is the idea, and if it worked out, would it have big impact on how we think about treating or curing diseases, rather than on, does the proposed method, is it likely to work? Right? I would rather have a portfolio of 50 projects where 49 of them failed and the 50th cures type 2 diabetes, than a portfolio where there's 50 projects, all of them succeed in publishing 5 papers, and none of them improve the lives of any human being.
So speaking of the grants, there's a whole lot of drama right now over the grants because there's been Doge cut some grants. I think when you came in, then you cut some grants, and then some grants got tied up in court in one lawsuit, and then some were tied up in another lawsuit. Can you just explain, like, where are these buckets of grants, and like what happened, what with when, and where are we at with this process?
Yeah. So a lot of those DEI grants that we talked about earlier, Paul. They were cut before I became director, including grants on like transing kids, right? So
Right.
some of those grants were cut before I became director. Now, as I said, I'm in favor of not funding research that has no chance of improving the health of people. So I was okay with that generally, but the courts essentially for many of those grants ordered the NIH to restore them.
Right.
So like a lot of and in fact made it so that we couldn't actually cut them. I put out a priority statement shortly after, maybe a couple months after I became director, where I said, look, DEI, we're not going to, we are interested in improving minority health, but we're not interested in funding DEI.
Right.
The courts essentially have said, I think as best I can understand the legal aspects of things, that for those grants that were paused, that they forced us to restore, we can't cut them. But
Okay.
when it comes to renewal, those grants no longer meet NIH priorities. I put
Okay.
a director statement that says, "Look, we are not interested in funding DEI anymore." So when they come up for renewal over the course of the year, we won't renew them.
I see. Okay. So these are grants that they were tried to be cut. The court said no, you have to fund them, and so the way that you're going to end those grants is by saying, well, we're taking a new direction. We're not funding this stuff anymore. Okay.
Yeah. And then there were some grants where the courts didn't overturn them. We terminated those, but we set up a appeals process because it's you want human eyes on these decisions. So we set up an appeals process where if you had a grant terminated and you thought, well, this isn't DEI, why did it get terminated? We set up an appeals process so you could get that reversed or renegotiated. Often, what would happen, Paul, is that you'd have grants that would have some good science in it, and but they'd be larded up with a whole bunch of DEI verbiage in order
Right.
to in order to like get it through the DEI filter that the NIH had.
Right. 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 So in other words, you're saying these were probably legitimate grants, but the people on the outside were like, well, NIH wants DEI. We're going to give them DEI.
Yeah. And so a lot of that was just, it wasn't actually part of the science, right? So
Right.
during the appeals process, we offered researchers the chance to rethink what they were doing, focus on the scientific part and not on the political DEI part.
Right.
And a lot of researchers took us up on that. So there were grants that were renegotiate that had DEI verbiage, but were not central to the grant. They refocused the grant on the actual science that they were proposing rather than on sort of this politicized nonsense. And so a bunch of grants are in that bucket. Yeah, and then there was just the ones that were terminated and stayed terminated, right? So those are the three buckets, like the stuff the courts that forced us to restore,
Right.
but don't meet our priorities and aren't going to get renewed in a way because they don't. We changed direction. We're no longer funding politicized
Right.
nonsense. A bucket of grants that got renegotiated to focus on the essential good science that was in the grants. Again, with removing the politicized nonsense that was the superstructure around it, and then the bunch of grants that got terminated that don't meet our priorities that the courts didn't say we had to restore.
There were also so like as you've started to do this shift over to chronic disease, there's also been quite a few of sort of vaccine and virology research related stuff that's because you're moving over from doing infectious diseases, which has been a huge a push inside NIH to study infectious diseases. And I mean, to me, when I looked at this, I didn't understand it at first, but then when you look to see what people are dying, I mean, I'll give you an example. I cannot like get up in the morning and read the New York Times or the news or whatever without seeing another story about measles, measles this. And I looked and I was looking, I was like, okay, so in the United States, 3 people have died of measles this year, apparently. Although one, it's sort of, did they die of measles or did they die of an actual bacterial infection, right? Whatever. Something like 9,000 Americans die every day. you know? So you read this crazy headline, measles, and then you're like, okay, wait, but like, um, 3 people died. Like, I mean, literally, there's like hundreds of thousands of people die every year from chronic diseases, and yet you guys are obsessed with infectious diseases and vaccines. And I wonder, to what degree do you think that is being pushed by the virologists who we think may have started the pandemic? I mean, I see them on Blue Sky all the time. Anytime anything comes up about a vaccine related infectious disease, they're freaking out about that. And I'm fine. I mean, we have to deal with measles, but like, of the things that people are dying of the things that like I wake up in the morning and I'm worried about dying of, it's not measles. It's just not. I don't care how many
Um,
times the New York Times runs a story or the Post runs a story about measles. I don't get up and worry about people dying of measles. I have other concerns.
okay. Well, so okay, there's a couple of things here. So first, let me just start with I do think measles is an important disease to prevent, Paul. So I am very much in favor of measles vaccination. I think
I'm
it's really
I'm talking
yeah.
about ranking it on the issues that like
Right.
that
So
you
no,
wake
but
up
I
thinking
just
about.
want to throw it clear and get that out of the way
Right.
first, right?
Oh,
So
okay.
yeah.
Oh,
So
so that you don't end up in the New York Times saying Jay Bhattacharya has denied that measles kills people.
it's a
Right. Right.
right. So I also think it's important for us to do research on infectious disease. So I just want to start by saying that
Right.
because it's important to remember that those are still priorities of mine and of the NIH. We want to prevent infectious disease. We want to develop treatments that are better for managing infectious disease. And once you get it, I think that's still a priority for us. So there's a lot of misreporting on this, Paul. But I think the key thing is that we've done it with the institute that focuses on that is called the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease. It's the old institute that Tony Fauci used to run, NIAID, National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease. Under Tony Fauci, he had structured NIAID with three pillars. And the three pillars were HIV,
Right.
civilian biodefense, and then
Right.
other.
Right.
Those are the three pillars. Like,
Right.
just think about that. All of the infectious disease. The problem wasn't that we're looking too much at infectious disease. The problem was that we were so lopsided in how we thought about infectious disease. All other infectious diseases lumped together in other. A whole pillar focused on civilian biodefense was essentially
Right.
with research that where most where that dangerous gain of function work happened was in that pillar,
Right.
and then
Right. And this is
HIV.
the thing. This is the thing I don't think most people even realize. I think very few people outside of the research community realize that, the NIH does biodefense research, that like Tony Fauci turned his institute at the NIH into essentially a biodefense research focus. I mean, this happened in 2002. There was actually even a letter, I think, published in Science about 15 years ago, when there was a bunch of scientists were really upset about the way he refocused NIAID to get more of this money coming in for biodefense. I don't think most people even realize that the
He
NIH
brags
did.
about it in his memoir. He
Huh?
brags about it in his memoir.
Oh,
Tony
okay.
Tony
Okay.
bragged about his memoir. Anyways, we've changed the focus. So the new director, the acting director of the NIAID, Jeffrey Tovenberg, a man who's been really unfairly vilified in he
Because he
has a
runs the
vision.
CIA. I mean, he's basically telling I mean, this is what I'm reading. It's like he's telling the government what to do on gain of function research. Apparently, I have no clue how a researcher like in NI who's not even in charge of the NIH. So like, but he's basically telling the NIH what to do. I mean, this is what the story. This, if you follow the logic of these people, he's running the NIH and running Department of War and the CIA, and he's running the entire government just to do gain of function research. Is apparently what I read when I read the Daily Caller. I mean, it's that okay. I'm sorry, but it
Daily
is
Call is quite
crazy.
frustrating. But I'll just say, but in particular, I think it's frustrating to me because I've had so many conversations with Jeffrey Toppenberger about his vision. So first of all, he has done research in the past on the 1918 flu. Now,
Right,
we could argue over whether that was wise or not to do. I mean, I think it was
right,
important because it helped us understand H1N1 better. But I don't think it was. I don't think it was gain of function. But people can argue about that. I think in the new
right,
process, you'd have an independent body that would oversee that research before he did it. Right. I'll just tell you, Tottenberger is absolutely committed to the new process. He wants an independent body over
right,
checking the research. He also wants to fundamentally transform NIAID in a much more reasonable way, right? So
right.
instead of those three pillars, HIV, civilian biodefense, and other, he wants to change the focus of NIAID where okay, sit down for a second, Paul. You're just gonna be blown away.
I'm
He wants
sitting.
two pillars. He wants two pillars. He wants infectious disease and he wants allergies and immunology.
Oh my goodness, I can't. Are we allowed to like not focus on vaccines and viruses and focus on
Well,
kids with
there'll be
allergies?
vaccines. I'm not saying there's not
That
going to be
allowed?
vaccines. There's
Right.
going to be vaccine
But
research.
is it allowed to have a little focus on allergies? Because there are a ton of kids that have allergies. Many members of my
Well,
family, you know.
just so we're clear, like they're not separate topics, right?
Right.
They intersect, and so like the philosophy is we're not just studying the bug, we're studying the interaction between the bug and the human being and
Right.
how we react to the bug, right? That interaction is what produces disease. And so, like, having the two pillars allows us to focus on to study vaccines because we're trying to understand how changes to the immunological profile caused by vaccines can improve our reaction to bugs in a way that's not ideological, but just purely science driven. But for HIV, what we're going to do, there was a big advance in HIV last year, 2025, where there's now a drug that can, if you take an injection for up to 6 months, probably even up to a year, you are not going to get HIV.
Right.
It's called lenacapavir. We've shifted the portfolio of HIV with the goal of reducing transmission of HIV to near zero by the end of President Trump's first term. With this new tool, the research that we need isn't like research to try to get to me, like the key thing is we need to try to get to use this new tool that we have and apply it so that we reduce transmission. It's the first real hope I've seen in a long time for reducing transmission of HIV to near zero. I've refocused the HIV research on implementation science to figure out how to use the tool, this lenacapavir, and some of these other new prep tools, as well as all of the existing tools for improving the health of HIV infected people already and reducing transmission from them. Those two tools together, we have a chance of actually eradicating HIV in this country if we just learn and do the research to apply those tools. We're still going
Right.
to continue to do some research on like HIV treatment and all that. We need, and, we still want to like maintain some focus on that, but that's not going to be the only focus of our research anymore. It's going to be focused on trying to actually reduce transmission in this country. So
It's
with
funny you
under,
bring that up. I feel like there's some researchers in the HIV field who like can't accept the victory. They just like they want to like, and I'm not trying. I'm trying not to be too rude about this, but like what they really want is not so much a cure for HIV or a way to. They just want more money coming. I mean, I'm not trying to poke too much at the academic community, but I am poking a little bit at the academic community because I mean they're not so much. They are focused on solving disease and stuff like that, but like when we have an actual possible solution that's gonna fix a lot of stuff like this drug, their complaint is like, well, but don't cut off my funding to like do this other HIV stuff I'm doing. Well, I mean, that's what I'm hearing a lot when I get off Twitter, when I
well,
get off reading the
no, I mean
media.
the thing is, Paul, is I think you do see the people that are used to getting money to do their research projects. They understandably, because they're the biggest advocates for their own research projects, think the world is ending when they don't get money for their research projects. But as the NIH, we have to do is we have to look broadly and strategically about where the money is going and ask what is the best way to improve people's health with that money. Right
Right,
here at HIV, we now have this amazing opportunity with lenacapavir and other PrEP drugs, as well as the existing drugs, much of which was the result of investments in some of these people in research by some of these people we're talking about. So I don't mean to dishonor them, but now that we
right.
have these tools, we need to fund research to figure out how to deploy them in ways that reduce transmission to near zero, because these tools didn't exist before last year. If we didn't take advantage of that opportunity, we wouldn't be using the money in a way that actually improves the health of people the best. And
Right.
so my job isn't to like make researchers happy. My job is to fund research that improves health of people. That's the philosophy behind HIV. We're gonna, but the point is like NIAID as a whole is shifting focus so that it addresses the actual health needs of people, right? Rather
So
than just the sort of the way the old way of doing things.
I want to talk to you about actually sent in some questions about this to NIH, but then we hit the shutdown and you guys weren't able to respond to it. So but since I have you here, what I sent in was there was a New York Times article about a study and it was in one of the Lancet journals. So I think it's Lancet's Infectious Diseases. So it's a good journal. And it talked about long COVID, and what it did was what the study concluded was that if you were vaccinated, you were less likely to get long COVID. And so so this appears in the New York Times, and I already knew when I because so the NIH put out a bunch of funding for long COVID. A friend of mine who's at one of the big research institutions on the East Coast was a part of applying for that grant that their university won. They got a big study center grant. And I was talking to this researcher later and I was like, how are you studying long COVID? Because they haven't even defined what it means right now. So like they were passing out money from the NIH to study something that did not even have a medical definition. So I knew this was going on. So when I read the New York Times piece, I pulled up the study and I looked at it, and here's what I found when you look at the methods. What it tells you is that they studied long COVID in patients from people who were vaccinated, vaccinated, unvaccinated, from January of 2022 till January of 2024. Okay. And they were studying what they called PSC, which is a way of defining long COVID, right?
Post
But
acute.
that definition for long COVID was not even put out until, let me see what it was, May of 2023, more than halfway through the study. And I'm reading this, I'm like, how are you studying something that you don't even know what it is that you're studying until more than halfway through the study? What is the value of this study? First off, and then how did the New York Times not read this study the way I did and realize that this study is kind of bunk? And I feel like that we put out all this money to study long COVID. There are people that I know who have long COVID. And from the beginning, I and other people that I've spoken to, researchers, have all been concerned about what the value is of the data we're getting back when we were like, because this guy over here is studying long COVID that he thinks means this. This other researcher is studying long COVID over here, and they define long COVID with all these other things. And it's not like depression, where if you're a guy at University of Washington and you're studying depression, and you're a guy at Yale University and you're studying depression, they're both studying the same things. They know what it means because it has a definition. Everyone's just studying like their own particular idea of what they think long COVID is. And so what is the value of all that data when you try to combine it together? Because everyone's studying a different thing.
I mean, so long COVID is one of those things where like we spent, I think, $1.5 billion or more
It was a
between
lot of
20.
money.
Yeah, I mean it's a lot of money, and we've not really made a lot of progress in addressing the needs of long COVID patients. And it's one of those things where like there's patients are understandably frustrated. A lot of the money that was spent on long COVID at NIH between 2021 and 2025 or 2024 was on trying to get a definition of long COVID. As you say, that study that like I looked at that study, the Lancet study, um, and it struggled with a definition of long COVID. It called this post-acute sequela of COVID-19, PASC.
Right,
It was like one of these. It was like they defined it based on symptoms, and some of the symptoms are quite nonspecific, right? Do you have
right,
headaches? Are you fatigued? Um, so the definition of long COVID is it's still challenging. I've seen now some recent work that because what the key thing is like, how do you distinguish long COVID from other post acute sequela of infectious diseases? There's things where you can get the flu and you can get longer term outcomes
right,
from the flu,
right,
right? There are other disease conditions that sometimes produce symptoms that overlap substantially with long COVID.
right.
Lyme disease, for instance, I've heard, right? And others,
Or
ME/CFS.
my MECFS. Was
Yeah,
another one that like has they're very, very, someone that I know thinks they got MECFS because they got a viral infection. They think that that's what triggered the whole thing.
an old med school colleague of mine just did a really interesting study using on Epstein-Barr virus and some sort of long-term consequences of Epstein-Barr virus. Anyway, so the point is that it's very difficult to distinguish long COVID from some of these other things, and it's important to be able to distinguish because the treatment that you might have might be different for long COVID versus long flu or long EBV or whatever, right?
Right,
And we spent $1.5 billion. We didn't that $1.5 billion did not produce a clean definition.
right.
Um, and people are
I mean,
still
just so you
arguing over the
know,
definition.
the person that I first spoke about this with on the at the university on the East Coast, MD, PhD researcher out there. He pulled out of this study specifically because he saw these problems coming. He helped to win the grant, and he's like, "I don't wanna be involved in this. This seems, like, really messed up. I can't like, I'm gonna go back to my regular research."
Yeah, well, I mean, I read that study. There were lots of problems with that study. The one you identify is absolutely true, like, 'cause they didn't have a definition of long COVID until 2023, I think it was, and yet they used data from before based on clinical diagnoses, somehow inferring long COVID before the definition like, a clean code existed. So, it had some methodological problems like that. The bigger methodological problem with that study was that it looked at kids, but it looked at kids who were like went to the doctor because they had COVID. Well,
Right,
most kids, I mean, COVID infection was really mild acutely for most kids. And so it wouldn't have necessarily produced a doctor visit. So they're
right.
missing a lot of people who never showed up to the doctor. A lot of kids who never showed up to the doctor. Their denominators are wrong. Anyways, there were a lot of methodological problems with that study.
Okay, so I wanna ask you something about this because this gets into so, like, you agree with me that this study had serious problems, but, like, here's the thing that happened. That study made it into a very prestigious journal, right? And then it made it out of that journal onto the page of the New York Times, and I just feel like so much of the discussion we've been having around long COVID, which, there's apparently millions of people with this condition, tens of millions of people with this condition in the United States, and we're not even studying it effectively, and we're having these, like, weird, like, misinformed discussions about it, like, in the academic literature and in the media. I think it's very frustrating, like, for people who have these who really are sick, and we didn't spend I mean, I'll tell you flat out, I think we threw a bunch of money away from the NIH.
Yeah,
We should
I
have
think that that
defined
money did not produce.
We should have defined this condition first. When I first saw it, I thought, like, we should put out some money first so that the community agrees upon a definition of what they're going to study. Then we release more money. Once we agreed upon what we're studying, we have a definition of what we're studying. Then let's start to study. Even if the definition is wrong, let's agree upon a definition so we're all looking at the same thing. And I just feel like they just threw the money out. And it's very frustrating.
Well, I mean, the money didn't produce the result I think that was anticipated. Like we didn't get a clean definition. We didn't get treatment. What I've decided with long COVID is that I don't want to wait for answers for patients. And the patient community has developed a lot of ideas for what seems to work for some people.
Right.
So I directed what the remaining long COVID money to focus on testing treatments that that show promise in making the lives of long COVID patients better. I think that sort of empirical focus is sort of a better use of the money now. We've learned a lot. Long COVID patients have suffered, and that suffering, while terrible, has produced some knowledge about how to manage the condition and potentially get better. I want to I want to do rigorous assessments of that knowledge so that that knowledge can be used by other people. I've also seen in the long COVID community, I've seen lots of like companies try to take advantage of them, frankly, Paul, with
Oh,
things that
yeah,
are not
sure.
well tested.
Of course. Of course.
So I think the best thing that we can do for them now is to assess rigorously the things that are out there and take their lived experience seriously in forming hypotheses for which things to look at. It's going to be I'm actually kind of hopeful. Like we did a long COVID symposium with Secretary Kennedy a few months ago, where some amazing researchers were sharing their ideas about what we might take a step forward. I'm hopeful that within the next year, we will have some potential breakthroughs. But we'll see. To me, the key thing is let's focus on things that look like they're promising and might work, and test them rigorously so we can get good information out to the community.
Because, I think, when the next pandemic comes along, we're calling it long COVID, but really it's just, extended effects of a viral infection. The next virus that comes along, we're going to see similar things. We're not going to call it long COVID. It's going to be long, whatever that virus is. So this issue is not going away. It's going to keep coming up again and again. I just feel like we had a chance on really trying to define this issue. And I think we just blew money out the door. So that's my take on it. I want to switch over to
Actually, Paul,
another
before
issue.
you switch, one last idea on this. Long COVID, I think, is a immunological overreaction.
Right.
But
That's what I've
that's
heard from some
one
people.
theory of it. That's one
Right.
theory of it, right? And it shows you then the importance of studying immunology together with infectious disease. By having the pillars of the NIAID be allergy, infectious disease, and allergy and immunology, and then and infections, having those things together, those be the two primary things that NIAID is focused on, having those focus be on the patient and the reaction of the patient to the pathogen. That entire focus then reshifts how we think about managing long COVID, as well as any other potential long-term effects of infections. I think that thinking about it in that way is going to be very productive, not just for long COVID, but for many, many other things in the future.
I want to switch over and talk to you because this is something that, it's being, you're seeing some of these discussions like pop up in the New York Times. There's some of the MAHA activists that are, really upset with the direction the Trump administration is going. And I just want to get your read on this. I mean, what I've noticed is that there's this sort of MAHA movement that, like, Kennedy sort of, brought into the mainstream, brought you along, brought Marty McCary along, uh, brought Oz along, like, under his umbrella. But you also have, the MAGA people, so they're more like directly aligned with the Trump issue. And then you have the old school Republicans who are kind of like on their own, some of them even like, we hate all this stuff. Can you talk about that? Because you deal with that dynamic inside HHS. I mean, I know for a fact from sources inside HHS, there are wars going on between the MAHA aligned people and the MAGA aligned people. I don't see this, in the New York Times or anything, but I know it's going on because I get phone calls from people inside HHS explaining this to me. Explain that kind of dynamic to people.
I mean, it's interesting because, well, I mean, first of all, Paul, now you're talking about a topic where I am just frankly an amateur. Like, I'm not a politician. I'm a scientist primarily, right? So, but I have watched carefully now over the last year internally, and there's definitely so. So first of all, why has the alliance happened in the first place, right? You have President Trump, who is an absolutely unique political figure. Like, he
Right.
used to be a Democrat, I think,
Right.
but his focus is he's certainly not a traditional Republican, and in fact
Right.
he went to war on the traditional Republican Party,
Right.
and won. What he's done is he's transformed the Republican coalition to now include a very large number of working class people that
Right.
that were previously more aligned with Democrats.
But what I explained it as is that, like, when this happened in 2016, you had the forces of Trump, you know, Bernie Sanders was the same thing. He was like an outsider trying to. The Democrats blocked him effectively. The Hillary Clinton wing blocked him effectively. Trump somehow or another, like, just burst into the Republican Party, grabbed a hold of the controls, and he won. He did what Bernie Sanders tried to do inside the Democratic Party, but couldn't get done because the Hillary Clintons were just they were too powerful, and so they blocked him effectively.
The Democratic Party is left with essentially their party of the university class, the elite, right?
Right.
That they've lost a large part of the working class that used to be part of their coalition, um, and the Democratic Party tried, I think, to address the needs of the working class by offering them health insurance,
Right.
Obamacare, where the promise was this insurance is going to make you healthier.
Right.
But the working class, honestly, if you look at the health trends in the United States, have gotten less healthy over time. As we said
Right.
earlier, life expectancy is flatlined, chronic
Right.
disease problems at scale, all these like health problems that have made the lives of working class Americans and regular people worse.
Yeah.
MAHA essentially says, look, what we're doing in health has not worked to make you healthier.
Right.
And so it's completely natural that there be this alliance between MAGA, the President Trump's coalition, because in order to meet the health needs of the United States, who are now like part of the who voted for President Trump potentially, and voted President Trump in much larger numbers than they previously had for previous Republicans. In order to meet their needs, you have to help. You have to have an idea for making them healthier.
Right.
That's an essential part of their life. So the MAGA-MAHA alliance makes complete sense, right?
But
Because
there's still
essentially it.
there's still fractures within it. I know there's wars going on inside HHS over
Okay, well,
this.
I was just setting it up, Paul. I was just setting it up. Let me start.
Uh,
Just let me just
okay.
say, like,
Okay. All
I
right.
think the alliance structurally makes sense. So all the like fissures we're talking about are
Right.
fissures that are surface level because the fundamental sort of political dynamics. Again, I'm an amateur, so correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me like
Right.
fundamental political dynamics is how do you meet the needs of these new members of the Republican Party who were previously they were had been failed by Democrats who offered
Right.
them insurance as a way to make them healthier. Well, it didn't make them healthier.
Right. A lot of them that I know that I interact with are former Democrats. I mean, honestly.
Yeah, and so like again, the
Democratic
MAGA-MAHA
Demo
alliance makes
Dem
complete sense.
Democratic Party activists, by the way, not just, like, sitting on the sidelines Democrats, like, they were actively involved in the Democratic Party, and they're like, "No, I'm done with this."
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the structural. So now the fissures, of course, you'd expect fissures. These were not like allies from 500 years. These were like
Right.
relative, like 2016 allies that
Right.
and in 2024 you have people who were at with President Trump in 2016 that are looking at the people who have come into the President Trump's movement through MAHA and saying, well, how come they're getting a seat at the table? We've been with the president all along. That's
Right.
what you're seeing. So you're seeing
Okay.
people who are like, we got to have more, I mean, like just more. We want to make sure that the people that we're bringing in the movement are really aligned with the movement, is what maybe some MAGA people are saying. Um,
Right.
and I mean, it's frustrating. It makes for some nice political gossip, but to me, that's not actual major structural problem. The major structural problem has been solved by the alliance in the first place. And the alliance happened because the needs of the working class populations that were brought into the coalition by President Trump need to be met somehow. And MAHA
Right.
is the idea that will meet, that actually is driving a lot of that coalition building that President Trump has done.
Yeah, it's crazy. Like, I mean, I was just talking to friends in the environmental movement, and just a couple of stories that have popped up in the last month, and I'll send them over to them. I'm like, could you ever imagine a Republican even considering something like this? Like, I mean, it's just like the weirdest thing. I'm like, what is going on? Like, I can't
Oh,
believe that this stuff
oh,
is
I wrote.
happening in the
Okay,
Republican
c-
administration.
can I give you an example? Right. So I wrote a paper in 2011, I think it was,
Right.
where I was asking if what would happen to or type 2 diabetes rates for kids if you took sugar sweetened beverages out of SNAP, the food stamps program, right?
Right.
And with this like simulation model, it's like, okay, yeah, it'll actually improve the health of kids by some bit. I wrote the paper in 2011. I honestly had forgotten I'd written it. I wrote it kind of hopeful that like some governors would pick this up and you'd remove that you get rid of like soda pop out of like SNAP programs.
Right.
And I've completely forgotten about it. Last year, the governor of Arkansas, Sarah Huckabee, cited
Right.
my article as a reason to get rid of sugar sweetened beverage. If you'd asked me in 2011, was it going to be someone like Sarah Huckabee doing this? I would have been, but it makes complete sense now.
Right. Yeah. No, it's just weird. I still have sometimes like wrapping my head around it, like when I see some of the stuff, I'm like, I mean, I'm getting more and more into it, and I realize it's still shifting, like it's still kind of fluid and moving around, but it's very bizarre. I want to ask you about, um, I mean, something that like the reason you and I even got to even know who each other is because of the pandemic and COVID. And, it's been very weird. I mean, I'll just give you I had a reporter. This is about it's kind of related, but a reporter that we both know sent me a message the other day, just like obviously just depressed about the current state of the media and just like I can't believe this stuff. And I responded back. I said, "Look, I get up every morning and I put out tweets about some crappy story that's like factually inaccurate, that's completely politically biased that I've read in the Times or the Post. I do it pretty much every morning. And every time I do it, I hate it. I'm just like, I don't want it to be this way, but it is the way it is. And I feel like, COVID, this pandemic fundamentally changed the way so many people, I think, look at academia, at research, at journals. I mean, the way I think about like, professional societies, the AMA, totally. I mean, I never really liked the AMA, and a lot of people like, younger people have been leaving the AMA for years and going to more specialized physician groups. But just the way I look at these people with just like so little trust now, which wasn't the way I thought before. It's certainly, I mean, in the first year of the pandemic, I did everything that I was being told to do. I followed all along. And then I just started seeing that like things weren't making sense. And I expected, this shift to happen. And people doubled and tripled down on the lies. And I just want to get your read. Like, what is your, I mean, you're a guy who went to Stanford at 18. lived there his whole life, undergrad, medical school, grad school. You've done nothing but, academic research your whole life. I mean, what is your read on this thing? It's like waking up one day and you've been a baseball player your whole life and you realize like, oh my God, everyone's been cheating and doing steroids and you were like didn't realize it. I mean, what's your read on this whole thing now?
I mean, I went through a real crisis of faith, I guess is the right word, in 2020. A lot of people I admired really just frankly lost their minds. Like they lost their capacity to reason when the pandemic hit. And worse, some of the most powerful people in science, you abuse their power to try to silence all discussion and consideration of alternate points of view during the pandemic. And the results were terrible. Like kids were out of school for a year and a half, they're still far behind. The depression and anxiety at scale, economic harm to the poorest of people in the world. I can completely understand why a lot of people lost their faith and confidence in the scientific institutions and the public health institutions of this country. Our results were terrible during COVID, and we were essentially following the advice of some of the most powerful people in public health and in science. Um, to me, my job is partly is in part to like to reform science so that it becomes worthy of the trust of the public again. This is why I focus so much on reproducibility, right? The one of the major ideas about reproducibility, sort of that undergirds it, is that look, just because you publish a paper in Lancet, Paul, doesn't mean you have the right answer. It's
Right,
just a paper.
right.
Truth in science comes from other people independently checking your work. And if they find the same thing as you, they assess your methods and they find it
Well,
rigorous, then
but that
then then you have some confidence that what you say is true.
well, that's what we're taught, right? As undergrads in high school, that's what you're told in high school. That's what you're told, like in when you're an undergrad taking a biology course or whatever, lower division science course. But that's not what really happens. That's not how the system really works. That we have
But
this
I want to
philosophical
change the
idea.
system, Paul.
Yeah.
I want to change the system so that is how it really works. In a sense, I want to fundamentally transform how we evaluate truth in science. Truth in science is not I got a paper published in Lancet. That is not truth. That's just a hypothesis. Truth in science is you have an idea that you bring data and test it. Your idea passes your test. Then other people look at it and they try to test your idea and they find the same thing as you or similar things as you. You come at it from a different angle, you find the same answer. That's how you determine truth in science. I want to establish replication as the standard of truth in science in reality, not just what we tell fourth graders,
Okay, but the
right?
only way you're going to do that is if there's right, and we know how this works in science. If you want people to do certain things, then you have to. They're chasing the money.
You got
So
to pay
where's
for it.
the Where's the money? Where's the money going to come
That is
from
the
for the
beautiful thing
replication?
about the NIH, Paul. I mean,
Right.
it's the single biggest, as you said, single biggest
Yeah.
public source of funding for biomedical research in the world by
Right.
far,
Right.
and has tremendous influence. Just a few ideas. One will start to like fund research on replication research on like the
So specifically for you'll be able to apply for a fund to just for replicating other studies.
yes, and the idea
Okay.
would be to let the scientific community decide what's the most important studies to replicate, rather than having the government decide. I don't want the government saying replicate this, this, and this.
Okay.
Replication shouldn't be punitive. It should be something that's collaborative, right?
Right.
Just because you have a study and hypothesis that turns out not to replicate, doesn't mean you did anything wrong. Science is hard. You just
Right.
you reached the conclusion didn't generalize, right? That's fine. Even a failed replication effort is an advance in science, scientific knowledge.
Right.
Second, I want to put replication really up above. Did you get it published in a top journal? So we're going to start having, you'll search for a paper and there'll be a replication button. You click the replication button and there'll be a summary of all of the other relevant studies that sought to replicate the research result that you had.
The same as like when you have a citation or an altmetric score, you'll have a replication score also.
Not just the score. You'll have a links to all the papers, so you can do
To all the
your own
papers.
assessment,
Okay.
right? And then you will have as well as the replication, and then the last thing is the metrics, right? So rather than just evaluating scientists based on how many citations you have, which is essentially a measure of influence, and how many papers you
Right.
publish, a measure of volume, it'll be,
Right.
do you share your data? How often do you share your data, make it available? How effectively do you describe your method so that other people can replicate your work? A whole other range of metrics that better measure what we actually want scientists to do. What I'm looking for is a transformation of science, of the culture of science, so that replication becomes something that people want to have happen to them, because you won't get credit for your work unless it's been replicated,
Right.
rather than something that's a threat to you. Oh, because if you replicate my work, I might have to retract my paper. If I fail to replicate my
Right.
work, I might have to retract my paper. I'm going to
Right.
change the mindset of scientists to want replication rather than to view it as a threat.
Okay. I've like a last question here, which is kind of a big one. I want you to critique my profession. I mean, I do it every day. I get up and I'm just like, oh my God, this shit again. Like, just so you know, my morning starts after I drop my daughter off in the morning. Usually I'm dropping her off in the morning. I go and sit in a cafe. Like I did that today. I didn't drop my daughter off today because we're on vacation. But I get up in the morning, take a shower. I go down to a cafe, open I have my phone in my hand. Here I am. And I'm reading. I pop up in the Post and I pop up the Times and I just like I scroll through and I click open things, and then from what I can complete reading with having something to eat, sometimes I don't eat anything, but 2 cups of coffee, usually an hour, and then I'm done and I try to like close everything down. And every day I'm reading stuff that's just terrible. It didn't used to be like this. I can tell you, I mean, I talk to conservatives who've always, felt the media is biased. Maybe I'm wrong. I didn't think the media was biased. I thought the media was center left, but like fair. I don't feel that way anymore. I have a lot of friends who don't feel that way anymore, that there's been a huge shift. And I honestly don't trust the media. And you tweeted out the other day that Science Magazine is fake news. So, like, what has been your experience? Like, how have you transformed, not just from your starting with COVID when you began getting hit by the media? Like, how has that changed and altered your idea of the media and journalists?
I mean, it's frustrating because a lot of the I've met, just to again, just to the throat clearing, I've met a lot of really good faith people who want to get it right in the media. And a lot of yeah, there are people I've met that I admire in the media. Um, but like, just let's just stay with that tweet about Science Magazine is fake news. It's been tremendously frustrating because I had a lot of respect for Science Magazine as a scientist. Um, but the news arm of it
When I
essentially
when I
engages.
when I first published a news piece in Science Magazine, I was so excited. I was so excited
Yeah.
to put that on my CV. That was about a couple decades ago, but I was very excited to put that on my CV. Now I'm just like,
Well,
is this
the
true?
thing, the problem is just bad faith engagement, right? So, like, you have reporters in Science Magazine who essentially will not report what we're doing at the NIH in any fair way at all, ever, right? They're going to go find political enemies to try to look at it in the worst, and they won't have a response. They won't, like, just earlier. I changed how we manage our funding of foreign collaborations. And they somehow misreported it as saying we are going to end all foreign collaborations. Just straight fake news. You have a reporter at the Science Magazine who will not give people who think that the pandemic potentially was caused by research a fair hearing ever in any
Right,
of his reporting.
right,
And so you end up with, like, a lot of scientists who get their news or science news from Science Magazine completely misinformed about what the actual nature of what what's happening at the NIH, what the scientists are actually saying and thinking regarding the evidence regarding a lab leak. On topic after topic, essentially you have a Science Magazine taking the sides of a certain group of people and will not treat others in any good faith way. It's quite frustrating because they have a major magazine that many scientists rely on for news and science, and they misreport things all the time. And I can see it firsthand because I have firsthand knowledge about what, for instance, the NIH is doing, and I read Science Magazine. And I don't recognize what they're talking about. Um,
right.
so it's quite frustrating. I don't know how to fix that. I do think that having other alternative ways of reaching people, like podcasts or Twitter or whatnot, does help. And so I'm going to keep doing that, even if people try to make fun of me by calling me Podcast Jay or something.
You are Podcast Jay. You're on a podcast right now, and your name's Jay. So you're Podcast Jay.
Sure.
All right. Well, we'll end on that. Happy New Year's to everyone. Happy New Year's to you. Happy New Year's to your family.
Happy New Year, Paul. So good to talk with you.
Okay. Thanks so much. All right. And I'm going to end with that. I'm going to call you.